rode my bike there, and by the time I got there, I realised, oh, I don't have a mask, so I had to improvise just my jacket over my face to go inside and do my shopping.
A lot of maskless people in here.
Yeah, exactly. So it worked. Got a bit sweaty, but it was all right.
Right.
So keen.
Cool. Is that most people? I'll just do a double check.
I was on an AI thing today, meeting at work.
All right. Hey everybody, welcome to lesson 7, week 8. Hope everyone's been well. Good to see you guys in person again. It's been a little while. I actually probably would have preferred being at home than having these on all night, but that's all right. Hello to everyone online. Tonight we're going through tabular data. We've got McCabe joining us, one of our mentors, to work through this session. Without further ado, let's get into it.
I've just got a notification on Discord saying that the notebook's been removed, so I might just have to...
Oh, it has? All right. Please hold. That's that one, and I will just check YouTube. How is everyone going on their projects? Excellent. Fantastic. And we will, we don't have the slides and the notebook up on GitHub. We'll look to get that up later tonight. Given that we are back to obviously streaming via YouTube for all the online people, we will use the lesson 7 channel in Discord for questions. I'll keep an eye on YouTube as well, but yeah, try and use the Discord channel if you can.
Okay, that should be it.
Ready to rock and roll?
Does anyone want to just try the link in the lesson 7 page on Discord? See if it works, please.
It worked earlier.
All good? Yep.
All right.
Yep.
I'll yell things from the audience if it's not working.
Yeah, hey everyone. Obviously going to be going over tabular data this week. How'd everyone go with material? Good? Good? Nice. So a little bit about me first. So I graduated uni last year. I did a bit of a different background. Oh, it's all good.
Sorry.
Go for it. Had a little bit of a different background. I did law and biomedical science as a dual degree. Found out pretty quick doing law that it wasn't for me, and started to probably transition a few years ago. Did the fast AI course in 2018, and then decided that I really wanted to get into that. Doing biomed as well, it was funny. I really loved biomed, but as I found, like, I wasn't a huge fan of the lab work, and a lot of the experiments and things that would be running, I found them really inconclusive, I guess, and that's what really made me quite interested in applying all these areas that I was learning about in AI to biomedical science. And so then I started getting involved, I guess, in a few research projects, a few summer projects, working on different things. And I started this year at a job as a bioinformatics research assistant at the Children's Cancer Institute down in Sydney. So I'm working remotely with that. And so I wanted to kind of just touch on as well some lessons that I've learnt broadly from cancer biology, but also how they apply, I guess, to machine learning and data science in any domain, I think, or just about any domain. And so the first one is that in the world of cancer biology in particular, but you find that ground truth is a real luxury to have, and I think that's something that's probably not emphasized enough in many domains, is that collecting the data is a huge problem, but then even once you have that, if you're working in a company and things, what you do with that, trying to convince the people higher up from you to take note in what you're doing and to try and change things, that's really hard. And the data in itself it's dynamic. So what we're doing, for instance, we're looking at the DNA of parents and children, and then we're looking at trying to measure the kind of predisposition to developing cancer. But if you think about that, you're kind of talking about, you're taking a sample and then you have a kind of static image of where that cancer growth is or that person's genome. But particularly in something like cancer, then you have something that can also evolve. And it's kind of like you're taking static images, but you're measuring something that's always changing. And in a lot of ways, I think that applies to anything. It applies to a whole different set of areas, and we have to keep that in mind when we're analysing our data too, is that, as we've already discussed in some of the previous lessons, what you have collected now, it may not be all that relevant in 6 months' time or something. And it can also be very messy. So this is probably definitely the case in biology, but just for a little bit of background, we're dealing with, I've got like a little description of a cell here, but the idea is that you have like cells and then in them chromosomes and then all this kind of DNA that's all condensed sort of thing. And so if you expanded all of this, you would have about like 3 billion base pairs, we call them, which are the different letters of the genome. And what we have when we do that is, I've got it down here as like, we call it a case where P, which is a feature set, is much larger than the number of samples that you have. So large P, small n. And when you're in a case like that, when you might have, say, 3 billion possible contributing factors to someone's health or anything else that you're trying to measure, but you can only say collect a few hundred, or maybe a very large cancer data set is probably a few thousand at most. You're really in a case where you've got to use your own domain knowledge to try and narrow that down and really focus on what you are actually trying to achieve with that. And I think that's also taken for granted in a lot of areas, and a lot of people kind of say, well, we'll just chuck something at it and see what happens. And you do have companies out there that are well funded and are doing a lot of that, but on a day-to-day basis, that's where your domain knowledge really matters, and working with the right people in focusing on what you may want to measure, and then kind of building that up from like a first principles basis. And I think that's why in a lot of areas they are really like statistical and probabilistic. They're driven by models that are based on having a few underlying assumptions. So say we know how inheritance works, so we're only going to use a model that has these assumptions about that. We're not going to chuck, say, like the whole genome at something necessarily. And then the other thing as well, and this is something that we're probably going to be touching on a little bit in the notebook, but when a lot of what we're doing now, at least, it's setting up the pipelines and things, and there's a lot of engineering that goes on behind finally getting to the data and results that we need. But small problems in that can have a really big impact on those final results that you have. And so you've got to be really careful say, for instance, if you're measuring patient data, that you don't change things too quickly without doing all the right validation that you need to do. And that's something that obviously we're really conscious of. But it applies to anywhere as well. Is that you need to have your sanity checks in place to really make sure that those kind of small errors that you may make at the start don't end up costing you too much in the long run. And then the other area too is that creativity is a tool, and you should use it. So what I mean by that, it's probably a little bit airy-fairy, but I think it's becoming easier and easier over the past few years to implement like an AI model, or to go from scratch and to really find that you can apply something in a very short period of time, which is what fast AI is all about, right? But in the last few years, it's become easier and easier, and we're also at a state, I think, where a lot of companies as well are putting a lot of money into trying to make this as easy as possible to people to use, so they can just call an API, which is what you can probably try doing too, just to see how easy that is. And so, that's perhaps it's not going to displace a lot of AI ML practitioners in the short time frame, but I think it really goes to say that if you're approaching these problems, looking at them differently and thinking about how you can go from that, say, like large P, small n situation, and then you use your own domain knowledge to try and like think about how you can apply that differently. So one example that I mentioned before was with a research project that I had. It was using like time series data, and I think also it's used as an example from another student in the fast AI course a few years back. But it's trying to turn time series data into image data, say, and then using that for classification. So that's just an example of, I think we do like to think of these areas as tabular data, and classification as being maybe images, and having NLP as some area. But if you can look at ways that you can kind of like tie all these things in together, or carry over some knowledge into other areas, then I think that's really beneficial in differentiating yourself. And so one example of that I had just in the area of biology at least was that this is from a data set on UCI, and it's on codon usage, which is probably a little part, we don't need to go into it too much, but basically it's a few letters of the genome, and then what they've done is that they have a data set collected of all the proportions or frequencies in all these different organisms, and they've been able to classify them into different species, and then we can take this data and we can plot it to kind of look at like what similarities they have. And so it's it could be a bit hard to appreciate without kind of digging into that data set and that domain, but that's an example of where you're taking all this data, so it could be terabytes or petabytes of data, and you're trying to summarize it, aggregate it, and then condense it down into a very easily interpretable kind of form. And so that's with a TSNE plot there. But that's kind of the background to where we're going with this. But I wanted to probably transition now a little bit more to the notebook that we have this week that I put together. And what I kind of want to focus on too is the data sets used for that, and how reviewing some of those and potentially finding errors in that is something that we're going to try and do through this lesson. So how many people have had a chance just to have a little look at the data set or the notebook? Or not many? Or yep, a few. Righto. Well, if everyone follows a link to that and kind of has a look through the notebook, maybe as I talk, but I can kind of walk through it, give a little overview, and then as we go through that, well, at the end, we can probably ask a few questions and start thinking about where the shortcomings might be in this data or in the analysis itself, and what could be improved in a future analysis. So we have the notebook here. But the context, at least for the first problem anyway, is that let's pretend, and by the way, someone mentioned an ethics kind of conundrum I saw on the Discord channel too. This kind of context is just made up, so the data set is publicly available, but I've just made this kind of context up, so don't worry, there's hopefully not actually a company, or there could be, but anyway, this context is just a little example context that we've made up. So let's imagine it's peak COVID, we're a machine learning consultant, and we have a client come to us from Brazil, and they're a large courier company, and their business is going crazy. And what they really find is that a lot of their employee absences are costing them a lot of money. It's really messing with their delivery schedule. And so what they want to do is that they want to come to us and have us build a model that can predict the employee's absence in hours, and also provide them with a bit of a report of the actionable factors that they may be associated with some of that absenteeism. And they think that they might use this for hiring purposes too. So the HR managers provided us with their entire employee data set of 740 complete records there. And we can then begin going through some of the steps that we might take to analyze that. And remember, this kind of following kind of workflow, or parts of it at least, may be flawed or suboptimal. So as we're going through, keep that in mind, and we can kind of get to the end and then discuss some things that we may want to look more into. So we've downloaded the data, or the data's been given to us. We're going to have a quick look at the data, so we can see that we have all the employee IDs, the reasons for their absence, month of absence, day of the week, etc. Right across, to the weight and height of the employee, etc. And then our label that we want to predict is the absenteeism time in hours at the end there. So we can have a little quick summary of the data. We see that all the entries are non-null for all of them, and then we can also decide which columns that we want to include as categorical columns. And one of the things as well is that you might have noticed in like the lecture material, but this whole distinction between categorical columns and numerical columns, it's a really big issue in machine learning, between regression models and classification models. And I think it's really shown very nicely in some form of how sometimes it can be kind of hard to distinguish, at least initially, between those kind of columns. So in this case, we've said that our ID, the reasons for absence, the month of absence, the day of the week, and the seasons will be our categorical columns. We'll convert them to that. And then fast.ai also has a method in there to use categorify and fill missing with their tabular objects that we can use. And then we can use that to split the dataset into 1/3 of the dataset for the training, and 2/3 of the dataset for training, and then the last third for validation. Split it accordingly, and our dependent variable, of course, is absenteeism time in hours, the one that we're trying to predict. we go through that, and we can again check the categorical columns, create our tabular object, and we just want to check how many are in each of these splits. So we have 508 records in the training and 232 in the validation. You know, that's looking pretty good. We can show what that looks like, and you'll see as well in this case it all looks fine, but you can see as well that in fast.ai they have a nice few helpful functions so that they'll show the data to you in a way that will still preserve like the categories and things, but behind the scenes a lot of that is actually converted to numeric integers. And then we can go through that and create a decision tree. And in our first decision tree, at least, we see that it's been split. The initial split, at least, is for reasons of absence. So that's split, you know, less than 20 and above, or 21 and above, and then that's also split as we go down the tree according to the age, the height, workload, and average day. And then again, we see here as well that the splits can continue to be made according to the same initial variable. So we'll see down here another one for reasons of absence, and then month of absence, etc. This is also another nice package called dtreeviz that you might have come across in the material, but we can see a kind of similar thing to here, but here we actually get an idea of the data itself and the distribution according to each of those entries. So we see the absenteeism, time and hours, all the way from 0 to 100, measured against the reasons of absence, like we were saying before, and then split into age, height, etc. So then, once we have that, we can look at the root mean square error, plot that against itself, and then also look at the number of leaves that we have in each of these decision trees, because that's quite an important parameter that we might want to change as well. So, for example, let's try more samples, increasing the minimum number of samples for each of these leaves here. So I think we've gone from about 8 to 25. And so we can see here as well that when we draw this tree, this is obviously going to be much wider, because we're increasing the number of samples that need to be in each of these leaves that are the kind of terminal points of the branches of a decision tree. And so we can move on to try a random forest then. We're going to set the number of estimates at 40, max number of samples at 508, and we can look at the root mean square error for that as well. And then this is one of the things that's probably nice about tabular models such as random forests is that and decision trees is that they're quite interpretable for seeing what the most important factors are. So we can, before we get to that, but I guess we can look at the number of trees and how they increase and the effect of that on our score. And once we have the predictions for that, we can rank them according to feature importance. So we can look at how different columns such as the reasons of absence or the age and workday, where they all fit in terms of their importance. And then if we look at the kind of plot for that, we can see that, hey, one of these factors, at least reasons for absence, is really important compared to the rest. But then it's probably worth noting, another few others like age, transport expenses, day of the week, month of absence, height. Some of those factors it seems to think are quite important in our results. And so if we're a consultant or someone and we're looking at all this and we've run this analysis, and we have a plot now that shows that there's this single factor that's a very large contributor, we could tell our client that we've identified the largest contributor, and we could also tell them we've identified some variables that are quite intriguing role in absenteeism. So, for example, height. What's the reason behind this? So maybe we could uncover some biological explanation behind this. Now that we think about it, we haven't actually looked at in the data, and it's not actually available to us, whether each of the couriers are male or female. So, perhaps we could say to the client, there's things going on behind there, behind the scenes. Maybe men are lazier or something like that. Because if they're taller than average than women, and there's a correlation there perhaps between the time in absence, perhaps that's going to be coming through here. So maybe we could report back to them that they need to begin collecting this data, or at least according to this analysis, that would probably be something that we would be thinking. But then just as we're about to send off the report to the client, our colleague messages us and they've said that they've rerun the analysis and the results seem to show that different factors are more important, and they've reached quite a different conclusion to us. So I guess in that situation we would start to think to ourselves, we've done something wrong, and we want to think back to our analysis, wonder what we may have done differently, what we may have missed, and a bit about the data itself, and whether there's anything going on there that we haven't considered, or that we haven't checked. So I kind of want to run this a little bit interactively, and does everyone feel like they're quite across it, or do you want 5 minutes to kind of go through it, have a look, and then we can kind of come back and we'll discuss a few things that may need to be checked out and flaws in the data or analysis. So hands up if you want 5 minutes. What's that, sir? See ya.
There's a link to it in the setup section there.
Yeah.
So we're taking a few minutes.
I think so. Yeah.
It's a little button on the side where you can drag the balls and go that. That makes it easier. And then that one, I imagine it's used as well. In order to use, if it uses the Tableau API, you need to put your credentials in there, and there's like a section from the Tableau notebook, you can just kind of copy in there and it'll put in the right spot. Or you can walk around and manually find it once it identifies it.
Are you doing a presentation tonight about careers, or what's that? Oh, final week. Yeah. 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 So when's that? That's 3 weeks away? Or? Yeah.
Straight past that.
Yeah. Yep. 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 Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Mm. Mm.
Just thinking these people still have to do stuff next week course and getting enough representing actually have to have the
Yeah. Particularly if you're doing NLP or something that's covered next week.
Particularly those, so maybe it's just the people who the stuff that's already been so it's polished expand the presentation maybe
Yeah. Oh, probably pay off. Yeah. Yeah.
and then we
Yeah. That'd be cool. Yeah. Yeah, because I feel like, the broader it is, the better in that way. Oh, like the broader it is, like the better in that way. Like, everyone's kind of working on very different fields. Yeah. Oh, cool.
and that way because if we were to do it to Queensland AI community there's so like we've already done the first 2 months it's pretty easy and that way if we do it earlier the community wants the same night so like on Tuesday
That'd be good. Yeah.
I'll look to everything in the next like 4 days.
Yeah. Cool.
There should be Peter too. So that you have an entry not absent for all the days they just like. So you can just be
Sick. Broken leg.
yeah, you want to have 14 tend to work full time.
Ooh, I think I found that.
Men like tend to work more hours.
Yeah.
I'll get that.
Yeah.
Or the actual distribution.
Okay, then you probably know. But I
Enough to
said
give it
so you should find it.
I like the visualization, so I also put in
What's that?
visualize my trees and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a big trade-off, isn't it? But it's quite nice to be able to see it in there. Like, yeah.
Do you have Shap's tree explainer in there?
No. But I know you guys have done a lot of work in that. I know you guys have done a lot of work in that area. Hey. Yeah.
But some of those
It chooses.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
regressor, it automatically chooses it. So it does see one.
But
So it's pretty much it'll.
how's everyone going? How's everyone feel?
Yeah. Pretty much it's being smart to try and find the best one there is. And then just doing just like a whole bunch of those
All right. What's everyone think? Who's found more than 5 flaws, or things that you think you could point out or talk about? Okay, 4 or more. 3 or more. 2. 2, some 2s, 1. All right, we have 2s but no 1s. All right. Yeah. What are your thoughts? What do you think?
So, including the data reason for absence is something that happens after the absenteeism, so it's not useful for predicting absenteeism in the future because you don't know what the reason for absence is going to be. And the second one was.
Oh wait.
Okay.
Yep. So data leakage sort of thing. What's everyone think? Does everyone agree with that? Do you think that having the reason for absence is data leakage because what we're trying to predict is the time or the duration of that absence? What's everyone's thoughts?
Sorry, what do you mean by data leakage?
Jeremy has a kind of link to the definition for that, but basically, do we think that variable that we have or that we may have included in the analysis is so linked to the outcome that we're trying to predict that it's essentially cheating in a way? And so an example for that would be a model that predicts whether it rains, but one of those variables that it's fed is whether it's raining on that day. So it's probably more nuanced in practice because there's another example about an IBM project that was trying to predict whether their customers would or who their clients would be by scraping their websites, but it was doing so later on once they were already clients. So they already had kind of material up on those websites talking about IBM or the products that they're buying. So that's kind of an example where we had data leakage between a variable that we're trying to predict and the feature. So exactly, like it's very nuanced in practice. It's not necessarily as obvious as, well, it's raining on that day and we have that variable that it rains. So what are everyone's thoughts? Do we have any opinions on whether reason for absence?
Could you use that field to almost prepare your data to filter out events that aren't related to the problem you're trying to predict? So if someone had annual leave because they're going to a wedding.
Yep. So you're saying
events from the data set because it's not going to help you predict the influence COVID has on sick days.
Yeah. Okay. So that's a really good point. So you're saying in this data set, maybe we should separate it between planned absences and unplanned, or is that?
Exactly.
Yep.
And any other conditions that we don't feel solves the business problem we're trying to solve.
Yep.
So
I was going to ask, so reason for absence is shown as, I'm assuming it's categorical, but there's a certain number of categories. So the way where it's split between the two of them, like is there a logical way to order these absences? That's an issue I'm seeing.
Yep. Yeah, that's that's a really good point too, is that we have just as you said, we have a categorical variable that are the reasons of absences, so they're all numbered between 1 and 26 or 1 and then an additional 7 or something perhaps, but and we're using a model, so decision trees and random forest, that is kind of treating that, it's making those splits in a continuous way. So it's not, making a distinction and saying, well, these maybe reason 22 and reason 23, as well as reason 7, should be in its own tree. It's splitting them on like a binary pattern like that.
How could you encode that variable better?
Why not encoding?
one
Yeah. Keep them separately.
Yeah.
Can you do entity embeddings with that as well? Would it help?
How would you do that?
Oh, I mean, you can do a neural network models and then just get the embedding layers out of it.
Yep.
And then there will be more like information in those values instead of just like random numbers.
Yep. So if we learn that kind of embedding space, so then we can begin to associate weights with those different kind of. Yep. do you think one of the things that we did see in the tree, however, was that those kind of splits. So we saw one example I think where it split according to maybe the age or something, and then later on down the tree it actually split on that again. So do you think would that be a kind of counter argument perhaps that this model can actually already do that? All right. On to your second point then, or does anyone else have another point that they'd like to point out before we go? Yep.
I just think that perhaps not necessarily to predict that someone will have the day off, but that the reason for absence could be good for determining the length of time if it's going to be multiple days or something.
Yep.
So
That's a really good point. Yep. All right. Do you have an?
Okay, so my second point was using ID as a independent variable because it's basically a random number that's been assigned to all the employees.
Yep.
So apart from maybe identifying a particular person who takes a lot of time off, it's not being useful as a predictor for employing new people.
Yep.
Or if it's not randomized, it'll be predicting based when they join the company.
Yep.
Model should pick that up, right?
Yeah. What's everyone think? Do you think having ID in there is something that we should include or drop or drop?
Because if you have a new person who has a different ID, the model's going to have some idea of it, but there's no signal in it. It's just learning your training data set.
Like if it's some kind of proxy for how new an employee is, that could be something that's useful. Maybe newer employees are less likely to be absent, but also there's no way to tell if the new IDs are like recycled or something, or if when someone leaves it's reassigned to someone else.
Yep. That's a really good point too.
You already got service time in there, but
Service
you
time.
already got service
Yeah.
time that could already capture a lot of the time in the job. Maybe just like that.
Yeah. Someone else had a hand up? Did they? No. Yep.
I'm not sure, but from what I can see on my phone from some of the dot heads, is the data set sorted by date? Because we select the first 2/3 as the training set and then the last third as the test set, but if they're not ordered in the right order, we might be sort of learning something about the future to predict the past.
Yep. Okay. So you think
Time series data set.
yeah, time series data set, maybe we're using more recent data and that we should have, so we haven't split according to time. Yep. What's everyone think? Do we think that could be an issue? Or Yep.
Another thing I could think of is correlations, because there seem to be a lot of variables that are quite similar to each other according to this graph that you show, like age and service time kind of like correlated to each other. So maybe we can try to remove some of them to see whether we can improve the model.
Yep.
I also wondered why they had some in there
Oh yeah.
and why pet was numerical.
Yep.
The number of pets we've done that.
Yeah, I'd have to check, but yep. Righto. No. Well. Yep.
One more, this is what we were saying before, but I can't tell without pulling this up on my phone, but it looks like, given that our mean absenteeism in hours is around 6, it looks like a lot of these entries in the data set are only the days when they've been absent, or maybe it's not including all the zeros in the data set. So it might turn out that you have some taller people, maybe men work more hours, they work full time because they don't have dependents, so they might take overall less days off, but because they appear more often in the data set, the model associates height with absenteeism, whereas you might have women who take a greater percentage of hours absentee, but because they work part-time and they appear less often, the model has a negative correlation with their height. I'm not sure if those days where they just work and they're not absent are actually included here.
Are you doing all this from your phone? Wow. Yep.
I got on PubMed yesterday to find out what other people have found.
Yep.
And it was weight and age.
Weight and age.
Weight and age, and there was a bunch of research papers on that, so I used a different.
Oh, on actual absenteeism.
There's
Cool.
research on this, right? And,
Wow.
and there's other research, like for example, women will often take up time, sickness time to look after children. So they're not actually sick, but they're looking after children.
Yep.
But so there's all sorts of research papers on that. But I thought that was a good way to sort of double check your work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
see what other
Yep.
people have done.
No, well, that's a really good point. I mean, a lot of the time, it's kind of, as a data scientist, it's like, oh, well, we'll find this data set, but there's a lot of academic research that isn't, those data sets aren't published, and
Yeah, PubMed's a really good place for these sorts of stuff. And,
yeah.
as you know.
Kudos. No, so yeah, these are all, I think, really good points, and here's a kind of few things that I kind of jotted down, but one of the things is that we kind of, and I know, not everyone had much time to kind of dig into this, and I think, when you dig into it, it's probably more evident, but we have quite a small data set, and we have a large imbalance in the number of entries for each, and in particular, the thing that we didn't check at the start was we were handed this data set, and we had 740 complete records from their entire employee database, but we didn't actually check how many of those were unique to certain employees. We kind of just assumed that, probably under the assumption that they're all different employees and all different records. But if we look at this, we can actually see that it's probably only about 36 different employees, and what that means as well is that a lot of those columns that they have, say for the employee ID or the age, etc., they're all shared between a lot of these records too. So even though this data might seem like a fair bit, in reality, a lot of those variables that we're trying to associate with that that label, it's not that many in the grand scheme of things that are actually changing between each of those records that we have. So we should have done probably a little bit more EDA with this. We should have really, tried to see if we actually had as much data as we did, and that leakage of test data as well. That was a really good point that was brought up. So down here we kind of have that kind of definition of that, but we have the, so it's the introduction of information about the target of the data mining problem, which shouldn't be legitimately available to mine from. And as we pointed out as well, the reason for absence, that's probably leakage of test data. Though I think, as we were discussing as well, like the business problem that you're looking at, that's going to be a large determiner, I guess, of whether it's actually leakage or not. Because there could also be an argument, perhaps, like if we were trying to predict whether it was like an unplanned versus like a planned absence. So then that way we might want to remove that, or perhaps we're told that actually, a lot of the case we actually have that reasons for absence as soon as we make that prediction. So it kind of also depends on like when we're trying to implement this model into practice, whether it's, at what stage we're gathering that information, and then therefore whether we already have access to that data to make that prediction or not. And so the other thing as well is that, that obviously, I guess, but there's a risk of a domain shift here. We're trying to use this so that we can better deal with the effects of COVID, and I think like it was pointed out too, that all changes very easily. And there's the potential as well, if we change these trees differently with the minimum number of samples, etc., that we could potentially see differences in the leaf size on the weighting there too, because we've got to remember as well that I guess this comes back to like the benefit of the random forest itself, but one of the reasons that they are quite robust in many ways, is because they are making like random splits across this data, right? And so as compared to a decision tree where we have kind of a handful of splits, the random forest is able to find like different parts of the data, different rows and columns, and then kind of average all of those across it to come up with these models. And so that's really one of the strengths, really, I guess, as well. But okay, so
So I have a quick question.
yep.
If we look at that visualization in D3
Yep.
look at height, I'm wondering if having an outlier, it seems like there's a really tall person at 196, is that having an impact?
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Do you just want to repeat the question, by the way? So that we
Yep.
can
Yep.
see?
Yeah. So someone pointed out that because it's a really small data set, one of the factors is height in the features that is ranked as quite important, and it's actually because there is a really tall person, 196 centimeters, that is skewing this, and that person actually has I think something like 100 or 200 different records, or it couldn't be 200 because that was just about the size of our validation set, but this person has a huge number of absences. So like we said, that means that suddenly this variable height has been ranked as really important, even though it is only an outlier with one person at that height. But because they have so many different records, and we're kind of probably making that assumption that they are independent and that they're not shared, we've seen that that's a false assumption. And therefore, we're having kind of weird things going on with our feature importance here. And so, if we're in a kind of scenario where we saw, oh, hey, height is a really, really big issue, and maybe it's because of, the gender imbalance or something, and then we went back to the client about that and said, this is what I found. We're definitely jumping to conclusions without really drilling down into what those, whether those outliers could have been attributed to that. So, exactly.
Okay, do you just want to call out the difference, the point that feature importance is about importance and it's not a positive or negative correlation? So it's not necessarily that it's a positive correlation with height. It could be the other way. It's just the size of the importance.
Yeah, yep. So that's that's a really good point that Michael made too, is that the when we're saying feature importance, we're not necessarily saying that if we have a high feature importance for height, we're not saying that that's necessarily positively correlated to the length of the absence, the Y label. It could also be negatively correlated. And so the feature importance is just, I guess, how much of an effect that does have on the overall outcome. It's not saying that, what that effect is, I guess. But if we wanted to look at like what exactly that effect was, we could also, and I'm not sure if I included it for this particular analysis, but no. But there are also, plots that we can look at, like waterfall plots. I think is in the next analysis that I have here. But it's where we can make a prediction, and then we can see how each of those different factors that we had contribute to that prediction that was made, and whether it was, say, like positive or negative, like that. So that's a good point too. Does anyone have any more questions before we move on to the?
How do you account for domain shift?
Sorry?
How do you account for domain shift? Like there's a risk of it, so how do you fix?
Yeah, like.
COVID is such a big thing. We will definitely have that problem.
Yeah. Yeah, so to be honest, like I think that's a good question. I'm not sure exactly how you could. I think there's limitations to how you do that. I think some of it could probably come back down to what variables you're measuring and whether they will be affected by such a domain shift. But it's Yeah, I don't know. You look like you
So
have some.
a couple things. The first
Yep.
thing is that most domain shifts happen because something happens over time, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at COVID, let's say that you didn't know why suddenly people were staying home. The most obvious thing to do is just throw in the date. So day of year, year,
Yeah,
and hopefully your model
yeah.
picks up that, okay, after the 20th of March, suddenly it seems to pick up. So the model should learn that, okay, at that point, I should know that it's probably going to be high. That will typically only work if you're predicting a few days ahead or a month or a week ahead. It'll just project in that direction.
Yeah.
So if you don't know what the reason is, just adding the date helps a lot.
Yeah.
Once you know what the reason is, it's just about throwing in factors that sort of describe that. So in the example of COVID, the best thing you could do is get some external data sources that maybe says the number of cases in a country or the category of lockdown, whether it's a simple lockdown, no lockdown, hard lockdown, and give the model some understanding of what's going on in the world around it, because the model can only make decisions on the data it has available. So your job in a tabular data set is give it the data that it needs to learn about the world. It can only see the variables you give it. So it requires you to have some understanding, but then it's just about getting whatever data describes that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty cool. Yeah. You can just add the number of cases in and that can pick up. Cool. Thank you.
So going back to that point that the data points are not independent of each other, should we resample from the data to make sure that every ID is only sample once? Would that be a solution? How would you solve that problem? Because effectively you actually have 30 data points, not 700.
Yeah, exactly. So
So do you resample?
The only problem with that would be that if you only resample that variable once, you lose out on all the other variables where you might have a really strong correlation with 1 week of the year, but whichever one you sample, you miss out on learning about the other variables.
Yeah, but you do that many times. So
You're saying pick only one example for each person?
yeah, but you do that many times. You build a model.
I think, like you're saying, that we will use just about all the data, but we'll only build those trees with, say, like the 30 unique individuals, and then we'll repeat that many, many times to come up with an overall. Yep.
What happens if you have a person who only appears once? They're going to appear in every one of those data sets. So now you're biasing towards the people who only have one example in the data set. And all the other variables for that case get seen over and over again. I think you'd probably want to have all the negative examples in this one. So like it seems like this data set only has when people are absent. So what you'd want to include is all the 0 days where people went to work and it was just normal. The other thing that you can do for some
you have a very imbalanced.
you'd have the different heights appearing the same number of times, like 365 days a year for each ID, and so you'd see each height appearing the same number of times. What you could probably do is add some regularization so that you actually drop that variable and you only sample 80% or 70% of the features, so that each tree in the random forest may not actually see that variable. So you only let each tree see half of the features, and hopefully it won't just fixate on that one variable.
Yeah, I think it's definitely like if we were in this kind of scenario, we would have to ask some serious questions, probably back to the feasibility of this approach and whether we did just have enough data in the end. It's not something that you kind of want to be going back to a client and kind of saying, hey, thanks for providing us with all this, but it's not actually enough, but potentially it could be the only option. And also I think the other thing as well, just before I move on from this, was that So the data source itself didn't actually have the date of any of these absences. So that throws up a number of problems too. Going back to like that mix of where we're using data in a kind of time series analysis that is later on, and it really restricts our ability to kind of split that accordingly. And that's again why we kind of had to rely on splitting it according to the employee ID for that. But yeah, there's some serious like limitations I think with some of this data, and it's not to kind of crap on like open source data or anything, but it's just to kind of emphasize that when we are using this, or when we're using any data in general, I guess we really want to be asking these kind of hard questions and seeing whether whoever it is that's providing us with this, whether they do have enough information, and if we're in a scenario where we are able to start planning the kind of initial collection of all this. This is all stuff that we really want to make sure that we're included on, so we can influence what we have at the end. Okay, so the next example that we have to run through is on predicting whether it's going to rain tomorrow. And so just before we go through this, does everyone want me to kind of do a similar kind of overview and run through all of it, and then give you a little chance to look through it, or do you want to look through it and then we'll kind of go through it? So look through it yourselves, and then I'll go through it. Hands up. I go through it, and then you look through it. Hands up. Okay, we'll do that. So in this example, we have a weather-based scenario. So let's say we work for a startup that wants to revolutionize weather prediction. So they want to use machine learning, big data, etc., to predict whether or not on any given day in a certain number of nearly 50 locations around Australia, it will rain tomorrow. We've been able to access records from the Bureau of Meteorology for this, nearly just over 10 years worth of data for this, and we're going to look at applying like a random forest and perhaps also a neural net to this scenario too. And so we have this weather data. So in this case, we can see that we have a lot of data, nearly 150,000 different records. We have the date, we have the location, and a bunch of different variables according to like the temperature, the max temp, rainfall, evaporation, sunshine, different information about the wind gust speed, and pressure, clouds, and temperature. And some of these variables, they're split according to whether it's at 9 a.m. or 3 p.m. This is on the day, and also whether it rained today, and of course our variable that we're trying to predict is whether it rained tomorrow. So that's a bit of the overview of the data. We can have a really quick look at the value counts for each of them. We see that they're pretty healthy. Nothing too weird by the looks of that. They're all, at least 3,000 or so for each of the different locations that we have. So that's encouraging, or 1,500, sorry, for some of these. And we can see that we'll create a few categorical columns to this. So in this case, we've selected location, wind gust direction at 9 a.m., at 3 p.m., whether it's rain today and rain tomorrow, which is a variable that we're trying to predict. That variable there. we can group these as well according to the year. So in this case, we do have information about when each of these records were collected. So it's all the way from 2007 to 2017. We can do a quick check there to make sure that all the years are kind of have enough data in each of them, and so that we know as well that if we select, so like the last 2 years, 2016 and 2017, for our validation records, we can check that we'll have enough in there. We can use the fast AI functions, so we'll take anything below 2016 and put it in our training data set, anything above validation. We can check the rain tomorrow value counts and see how many of those are, and define our splits, and the continuous and categorical columns for that too. Create our tabular data object. This is what we were saying before a little bit with what fast AI is doing behind the scenes, but it's able to show you each of these categorical categorical labels, but then behind the scenes we can see that it's been all converted to integers, which is good, because that's what our model will actually be using. We will see that we have a tree here, so a simple decision tree. We can see that it's split initially on humidity, max temp, sunshine, and so this was only using 10 for the size of that. We can see as well with the D-tree viz how this looks. So we can see our rain tomorrow and the humidity at 3 p.m, the max temp, sunshine, rain tomorrow, etc. We're going to use root mean square error here, so we'll define that and we'll have a look at what that is, and then we'll look at the number of leaves. We'll have a decision tree regressor here as well, and we'll fit this to the data. We'll have another look at the root mean square error for that, and now we'll try a random forest. So we'll define the random forest, have another look at that, the root mean square error for that, and the out of bag prediction. So this is probably just worth touching on really quickly, but the out of bag prediction is that in this random forest, when it's making during the training phases, when it's selecting all these kind of random permutations of the data, at the same time it's also testing each of those models against the data that it isn't selecting. So while we're training, I guess we're able to also select a portion of the data that hasn't been included in the training and test as we're going, how we're going on that. So then we can also look at the standard deviation. So for example, like the standard deviation of the first few records that we have there. And then we'll also look at the feature importance too. We can see that the humidity at 3 p.m. has been selected as the largest of the largest importance in the model, followed by rainfall, pressure, things like sunshine and wind gust speed, so forth. And again, we can look at the out of bag score on that. The validation, we're just looking at the humidity 3 p.m, so the histogram for that, it all looks pretty Gaussian distribution, normal distribution for that. We can also look at the partial dependence plots for these. So for the features that we identified as having a large importance in the model, we can plot these and see what how these relate to the outcome. So we can see here that the humidity, for example, at 3 p.m, depending on what humidity that is from 0 to 100, what effect that then has on the variable that we're trying to predict, which is whether it rains tomorrow. So having a quick look at that, we can see that that's pretty intuitive. That kind of lines up with our understanding that humidity at 3 p.m. probably would be positively correlated with whether it rains tomorrow. And we can see sunshine as well. We can see sunshine that I think this is a number of hours of sunshine, so a larger, more sunny hours in a day seems to be correlated with, negatively correlated with whether it'll rain tomorrow. And so that's kind of nice to see, because like we said before, feature importance tells us whether it's how important it is. This kind of gives us a bit more of an understanding of what effect it has. So like we mentioned in the previous analysis too, we can look at a waterfall plot for these. So taking a small handful of predictions, we can create a plot to see what effect, I guess, each of these different variables have on the outcome that we want to have. So we can see that the humidity in this case was negatively associated with that. So we would probably assume, I guess, that in this selection that the humidity at 3 p.m. was higher. Or sorry, actually would have been lower, and that it probably did not rain on those days for that. So we can turn our attention to a neural net now. We can have a quick look at that. We can see that we're going to specify like a max cardinality too. Not that it probably matters, because we can see in all our categorical columns that the highest cardinality is 366, which is the number of days or the day of the year. And we can move on to using categorify, fill the missing and normalize. And we'll start our training, specify the range of the data that we have, and then we'll select a learning rate for that. We can follow the training loss, and then the validation loss we can see is kind of plateauing there too. We can look at our predictions to that and the associated targets to that, and plot a mean square error for that too. So in the interest of time, we probably will try and be a little bit quick here, but according to this analysis anyway, we're going to say that we've learnt that humidity on 3 p.m. at any given day is the largest contributing factor to whether it rains on the next day. We've seen that, interestingly, this is ranked even larger than whether it has rained on the current day, which might be a bit surprising. Our overall performance is a bit difficult to interpret, but what matters is that we see the rainforest had a lower root mean square error than the neural net, and we say that this is somewhat surprising because apparently it was improving during training, so we claim, and we then show our CE-OVIS model, and one of the first questions he asks us as well is whether we should have included the rain today variable, because he says that it's so similar to what we're trying to predict. So, are we right to, do we have any thoughts on that right now? Or
To answer your question, this is obviously a very structured data set. But what would happen in a scenario where, for example, the humidity at 3 p.m. only deemed it as a highly weighted feature, but it only exists in a small portion of the data sets? How would you go about almost the feature design where you may not have all the same data points across the board? Do you group them? Do you have different sections based on the available features you've got?
yeah, sorry. Oh, so the question was, if we have a very large, well-structured data set like this one is, but in the case that we had a variable that was very highly associated with the outcome, so very important, but we only had it collected on a very small amount of the data, what would we do in that scenario? Could we weight it, and how would we kind of deal with the fact that many of the entries did not have did not have that feature. Is that, yeah.
Yeah. So you may not have all the same data points for all the different locations, for example.
Yeah, look, I'm not too sure off the top of my head how you would. I guess one question, or the first question that I would have, but would be how would you know that it was an important variable in the first place? And I think to know that in the first place, you'd probably have to run some kind of analysis like this, unless you were making the assumption that it was off the bat. But then to run some kind of an assumption like this, you kind of go back to the point, well, what do you do with those variables that aren't? And I think that Jeremy touches on it too in the lecture, I think, but sometimes not having a feature is a feature in itself. So I think there would, we could just encode that as its kind of, if it was like a categorical variable or something, we could potentially create its own category out of that, and then we could use that to determine whether that was an important feature. I guess once we had that, once we knew that it was important, but then we would go back to that question of, well, what do we do with that? So I'm interested, does anyone have any thoughts on what they think you could do in that scenario? Yep.
I think we can run a subsample of a variable in a very simple module like decision tree. Like we're going to permutate the variable. For example, if you have like 12 variables, you can run a subsample of 9 variables, and then it's just permute through them, and then you want to run into a very simple one like decision tree and plot the result, and you will see which variable would really affect or important to the model. There is a tool, I think it's a script on machine learning mastery, they did it.
Yeah, okay, yep.
So it's already there, so we just need to run it to see, and then you choose the case. Case like you say, oh, you want 9 variables to work on, or would you see like you consider that variable you want to drop but you're not sure?
Yeah, so once you've done that, but what would you do then with those variables that didn't have an entry for that?
I think dealing with the NaN values is always like really important, and it depends on how we look at the data as well. The notebook here, I don't really see that we did anything like exploration on the every single variable, so it's really hard to answer. But we need to visualize them, and then we did like value count, whatever. At least because I see the entries are different, but we didn't do anything with the NaN value.
Yep.
That would be a problem as well.
Yep. That's a good point.
I think, McCabe, you touched on it, which is if it's missing, why is it missing? And there's like 3 types of missingness. Missing at random, which means kind of like if a sensor just stops working on and off, and maybe you get it, maybe you don't, but there's no rhyme or reason behind it. Missing not at random, which is that there's some mechanism behind it, and then sort of missing completely at random, which means that it's just, there's no like right or let's say missing completely at random, that's where it's no rhyme or reason. Missing at random, and then most importantly, missing not at random. So you might find that maybe the only site that you've got that reading at is Uluru, and it happens that it never rains in Uluru. And so you touched on what to do then. You can fill the missing value. You probably don't want to fill that missing value with something in the range of normal values. Let's say you could have something between 1 and 100. If you're using a tree, you could make it negative 100, and the tree will learn to slice between the regular bottom value and the missing value. But if you've got a linear model or a neural net, it's going to learn between 0 and 100 and then infer what happens at negative 100, and you sort of, that missing fill value becomes an issue then. So you've got to, depending on the model, that's going to change what you do. But the other thing, you could do is, once you fill that value, maybe you fill it with the mean or the median, then create a second variable that you feed into the model, which is a Boolean of 1 or 0, which says, was this originally missing or not? And that way, at least your model has some signal of you know, you can see that there's a new value in there, but at least it has some additional signal to say, well, if it was missing not at random and there was some rhyme or reason, you're giving that information to your model as well. So it gives an extra sort of nuance to, you know, whatever you filled it with. But it's usually going to be case by case. That's where you need to know how was the data collected and do EDA on that variable.
Yeah, I could see an example where for this one, it may be a weather station where somebody once a day does one measurement and stores that. And then you may have another example where you've got sensors that are almost real time. And how would you handle those two different type of data entries?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, thinking about that too as well, if we are saying that it is let's say that we say that it's a really important variable, but what is that a really important variable for? Like, you know, which records does that apply to? So if, you know, maybe it is a really important variable, but only for those ones that have it. And so then we'd kind of have to ask the question of whether I guess if it's, you know, obviously if it's not that useful for the rest of them, whether we really want to include that, yeah, depending on what the data kind of looks like too. But yeah, that's a good point. Yep. Yeah, does anyone have anything else that they want to touch on? We probably do have to kind of start wrapping up soon because I think we have another team that wants to do a presentation. But yep. Oh, that's you?
Yeah.
Oh, yep.
Let's go for another 5 minutes and then we'll do the presentation.
Yep. Yeah, cool.
One of the teams online, Neil, has said, since the data set is imbalanced, root mean squared error is not a metric I would use. I tend to use error under the curve, OROC or AUC as an appropriate metric, and I think that points to the fact that we're actually using regression for a classification problem.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, so, yeah, exactly. That's one of the things that we are doing in this is that we're we're using regression on a classification problem, and there's a big question of whether we even should be doing that in the first place. I guess in this case, what do people think? In this case, does it matter or does it not?
So we did.
There's sorry. I noticed with the rainfall that it's -1, 0, and 1, so it's not rainfall tomorrow. So that might be why you have humidity as a negative correlation, because there shouldn't actually be a negative outcome. But I had the same. Actually, had the question about whether to use a regressor or classifier on the projects we're doing, and was finding that I was getting slightly higher predictions with the regressor. And that I thought, well, maybe it'd be okay because it's a 0-1 prediction. Then the mean of the predictions out of the decision trees would relate to the one variable rather than the 0. And that would be fine, but I mean.
What's the difference between using a regressor and a classification model under the hood?
Decision trees, it would be how they deal with the output from each individual decision tree. Right?
Would it change how the tree is built? It may be yes
or
no.
Well, I suppose the error, so they'd use mean squared error versus another sort of loss or function.
Other than that though, that's probably going to be it, right?
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know any more than that, but that was where I got to, and I still don't know whether it seemed wrong, but then if it's working.
So
what do you do?
It seems like maybe the only difference there is actually just a loss function, right?
Yeah.
So maybe a binary cross entropy loss is a lot steeper at the other end when you get to -1, whereas your root mean squared error is sort of going up to 1, and what's it doing? It's doing this still, but it's a different sort of curve.
Yeah.
So it might just be the case that for your data set and your distribution, that loss function tends to generalize better. It might just be like flipping a coin, honestly, different per data set, but at the end of the day, it's actually somewhat valid because a classifier, the only real difference between them is that your classifier, it's your loss function, although you could actually just use the same one, and then the fact that you've got a softmax on the end, because your your regressor spitting out numbers in a whatever the range is. Your classifier is too. It's just that you throw a softmax on the end to squish it down. So function, like they're actually quite similar under the hood. So the only real difference there is the different loss function plus the softmax, which is non-linearly modifying your outputs.
Yeah, well, because also the sort of metric that was wanted was a probability. So sort of just because you can't plot a confusion matrix, does it really matter?
Exactly.
You just, instead of forcing it to be 0, 1 to then predict whether it's between some continuous value, it didn't make sense to me, right?
What would be the possible range of outputs from your regressor?
Should be 0, 1.
Would it?
Yeah. Because it's still.
Because I thought random forest can only predict based on the values that you give the model, so it's only
It should
0
be
and 1. So
on
the
the dependent
probability should
variable.
be
Random forest should go between the two. What if you're using a linear model and you were using a regressor instead of a classifier?
Yeah, probably depends. Yeah, don't have a good answer.
You could end up
Yeah,
predicting
you
more
could
than one,
extrapolate,
right?
Yeah.
Because you're not
Yeah.
capping the ends. Yeah.
I haven't seen that in the data we have, but it's only one sample.
But that's the thing, your trees aren't going to end up where you shoot off the top.
Yeah.
It'll just sort of,
So
be
then
somewhere between the two. Yeah.
Yeah, when would you not want to use, when would it really matter a lot if you were using a regressor compared to a classifier as opposed to this example?
It'd be the other way around, where you're trying to use a classifier or continuously.
Unless you scale your target down.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, anyway, we can move on.
no, like that's bingo. You kind of got it. That's where what I kind of wanted to touch on with this is that So when we were running this, the loss function that we use, so continuous versus categorical, on the face of it, that does look like an issue, but it's also something that, in this case, because we're only, it's kind of like a binary outcome that we are predicting between 0 and 1. It's not like we're kind of facing potential issues, going between, 5 different classes or something that would make it really messy. It probably is up to us, to try those things and find if one of them does work better or not. It's not. I think you will have, like rule of thumb, probably more noise trying to use a continuous model on something that is categorical. But yeah, it's something that you could try too. For the Y label, exactly. That's something that we didn't do enough EDA at the start. We didn't really check. We kind of did a little skim over to, some of our classes, but we didn't really check whether our Y label was always between 0 and 1 anyway. And so, negative 1, obviously, I guess, because there's null values in there. And Jeremy makes the point as well during the lesson that, sometimes it's a little bit like our variables themselves, like our input variables. Sometimes whether they're missing, that might be a feature in itself, but also whether your Y label is missing, maybe that's something that we want to try predicting. But regardless of whether it is or not, I guess, that's something that you want to check from the outset and perhaps, drop those in that case. Suitable metric versus a loss function sort of thing. In that analysis, we kind of were comparing different models completely using the loss function, like the root mean square error or mean square error. We didn't really look at accuracy, so like the metric itself, like how we were going. So that's something that we'd obviously want to check and would help us assess that. And the rain variable as well. So what do people think? Do we think that the rain variable, so having having whether it rained on that day, the current day, is data leakage if we are trying to predict whether it rained the next day?
Well, I think that when it is raining, your humidity is at 100%. So you probably, and if it has rained that day, your humidity is going to be high already. So my view is you can probably drop the raining today column and just use the humidity at the two humidity ones that you've got. Probably, I would imagine the 3 p.m. one is probably more important. You know, I used to teach physics, so one of the things we used to do was measure the humidity and say, why is it humid? Well, I'm from New Zealand, right? So it's raining outside, that's why the humidity is so bloody high.
What if you've only got 2 readings of humidity at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. but it rained at midday?
Well,
and that captures.
Yeah, well, your humidity is going to be higher later in the day, isn't it?
But what if it rained in the middle of the day and those 2 readings only give you 2 snapshots, but you don't know what happened in between?
I don't know the answer to that question.
But there is also another rainfall
Yeah.
column as well, which has another sort of could be capturing the same information as those other 2.
Yeah, does it really need a did it rain today? If there's a rainfall value and anything that's higher than 0 is a yes. It seems like duplication of information.
So that's captured with.
Also, another thing, I mean, are you really revolutionising weather prediction if you predict the next day?
Yeah, exactly. It was kind of just to go in with the buzzwords of
Yeah,
you know.
that's sort of thinking, if that was a real use case scenario,
Yeah.
probably tell your boss it's not going to revolutionise it.
Definitely.
One interesting thing is that if you look at that input data, what's the latest reading? Is it 6 p.m. or is 3 p.m. the latest?
I think so,
Which
yeah.
means that if you were to deploy this model to production, you wouldn't be able to make a prediction until that last variable comes in. So that's something, particular tabular data and time series, you've always got to think, when I deploy my model to production, am I going to have these things? And particularly when you try and use weather, when people try and, for example, let's say you're trying to predict foot traffic at a fast food restaurant, something that I've done and tried to use weather data, often what people will do is say, right, I'll go get all the historical data, you know, exactly what rain happened on that day, and use that in my model, you know, and that can take place for a forecast. But if you were then to, you know, make your prediction tomorrow, all you have is a forecast. You don't know what actual rainfall is going to happen. So if you wanted to use weather in a model, you'd actually have to go back and get all of the forecasted weather on that day, which is a lot harder to get than the actual rainfall. So it's really interesting when you try and do some of these tabular data time series problems, you always have to think, right, am I actually going to have all of these variables? And is the one that I have now the perfect version? Whereas when I try and make a prediction in the future, I'm not actually going to have the real value, I'm going to have a prediction, and that's going to be different. So it's quite interesting.
So a good baseline might be, what happens tomorrow is what happened today.
What do you mean?
Well, to see if your model's improving on just a straight random, if you like, or you could use today's model, today's weather, did it rain today, yes or no? Run your model, did it rain tomorrow? And compare the 2. Which one's more accurate?
Potentially.
Yeah.
Different input data though.
Yeah, but you can still get
that rainfall.
Yeah.
Kind of like a Bayesian kind of. Righto. Well, with that, I think I better hand over to the other one of our teams. They want to do they've volunteered to do a presentation on their project, and that's using tabular data. And so I think that'll be a really great example of probably, you know, taking some of these methods and probably taking them a lot further, trying to, I think, use a bit of deep learning with that, and use a whole bunch of different approaches that we haven't really covered here. So with that, do you want to come up and...
So, how are we going to do this? Can you open your Discord channel?
Oh, yeah.
Because we have a link over there that we can use.
Do you mind if we open Discord on here? Yep.
Do you have a link to it?
Yeah.
Awesome.
We have a
Did
blog.
you send it to me on Discord?
We sent it to the open channel. So to
Oh,
our
yeah.
to our channel.
Yeah, it's on channel.
Yep. So that's tabular data in person one.
There you go.
And that just at the end, I just set it down.
That one. Yeah.
Yep. So
There you
that's
go.
the website.
Do you wanna? Yeah.
Okay. Okay, if I take over now.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, go for it. Yep.
Thanks, McCabe.
Alright, so my name is Tracy and I'm from Tabular In-Person Group 1. And today we would like to share with you some of the fast AI functions that we use in our group projects to improve our fast AI model. So as Jeremy mentions in his lesson about tabular data, there's two main methods in modeling tabular data and structured data. The first one is the one that McKay just introduced to you, which is ensembles of decision trees, which include random forest and gradient boosting machine. And the other one that you can use is neural network. But the former method is far more popular and usually our first approach when analyzing new tabular data set. This is why in our lesson we were focusing more on how to train and improve performance of random forest model, but we wasn't going too deep into how to train a deep learning model. So, however, because this is a deep learning course, right? So that's why we also want to explore some of the methods that we can use to train and improve the performance of a deep learning model for tabular data problem. So we are going to discuss about how you can do feature engineering for your deep learning model, how you can do hyperparameter tuning, and also how you can combine different models, because obviously we have random forest model, we have XGBoost model, we also have neural network model, so we can try combining all of the models together and to see whether it can improve the score, the performance score. And this is exactly what we are going to talk about. So the first part, Nissan, my teammate, is going to talk about how to create a basic deep learning model for tabular data. And he's going to do some permutation analysis to identify important features as well. And yes, you can do it for a deep learning model. And then he will try to ensemble some of the models to see whether it can improve the score. And in the next part, I'm going to come back and I'm going to show you how to do hyperparameter tuning using Bayesian optimizations. And at the end, I will do a quick entity embeddings model by pulling out all of the embedded layers of the fast AI deep learning models and use it for XGBoost and random forest model. All right, so I'm going to pass it to Nissan.
Hi. So there's nothing terribly special that I did. I just borrowed a lot from Jeremy's work and Zach, who does work with fast AI. So if you haven't watched his videos in tandem with Jeremy's, I really recommend you do that, because Jeremy is great and Zach brings it back down to it a lot for those of us who are mere mortals. And I like that approach that he took. So you're going to find yourself in tandem between them. So all this is just regular stuff where we download the data. But when you start looking at the data, like, so to give you context, we're using the home site data project. Home site lets you determine if there's a sale or no sale based on some like very abstract data values. So we can't actually into how we interpreted what rainfall was meant in this example from before. We can't do that here. It's just numbers. We can guess it's a geographic field or it's a personal field, but we don't know what that field means at all. So it's all very number-ish. So one of the first things we did was I kind of kept my values here that I'm setting every time, even though you can predict them later on. It just kind of made more sense to kind of keep it stable. Tabular Pandas, which is part of FastAI, does a lot of stuff for you, but you still have to do some things before. So like you can separate things into categorical and continuous variables using the concat split function. But what they don't tell you is that you have to set max cards a little bit higher, because if you look at the data and you explore the data a little more, you realize that that by itself doesn't actually split it out properly. I actually ended up writing my own function, then realized that you could actually set the tolerance value above the default of 20, and you actually get more categoricals, which seemed to help the model, and that was interesting. So you have like category 5, which then does the categorical bits for you. The fill missing, which will then add the column for the categorical fields that have missing values, so that they're there. And if it's a continuous field, then it will just, I think by default it does the medium value, but you can set it to medium mode or something else. and then normalization just kind of balances out the curve. So there's actually another piece that no one sees, like when you do the finder, there's actually several points you can pick for your learning rate. So like there's the valley, the slide, the maximum, and the steep. And if you play with each value, like each one has had significance in different papers for like effectiveness. But by seeing where they are in each of these, like the 1E neg 3, the default value that Jeremy always promotes, you can see why it is it comes about, because like it's usually one of these 4 values, and that usually performs the best, but you don't know which one. So I think his logic for 1E neg 3 is that it's going to be one of these 4 values, and that's probably the model learning rate that you're going to use to get the best performance for there. So the part that we're talking about is permutation importance. So Zach actually had some code that would go through all the different columns and do like a permutation on them to say, well, if we took this guy out or if we change this value, how important is it to the model? So we did that for, so this one was doing it for the deep learning model. And in this case, you can see that there's 4 values, which is property field to personal field, blah, blah, blah. We did the same thing with XGBoost. So we did a permutation importance on this one, and you can see it's different fields. So that's good, because if 2 different models are taking 2 different fields, 2 different sets of fields is more important. That means if you combine the 2 and the averages that they predict, where they agree, they really, really agree. So it's a really strong positive. You know, it's like a Democrat and a Republican agreeing about the same thing, and you know, it's got to be really good if they both agree. But then we added on a third one, which was the so we did the average between them, where we took the scores of each one and then we averaged it out, and we did the area on the curve, and it actually turned out to be better than either one individually in terms of prediction for the training for the validation data. So then I said, okay, cool. Well, what happens if we add in a third one? So we added in random forest to see what would happen, and we looked at random forest, and we did and again Zach kind of pointed out, like, don't use the default importance value, use this guy, and this one's really long, but because it doesn't have a short one, but it's also different fields. So we added that guy in, and I think I made a small note here where it said it got worse. It varied. The first time I ran it, it got worse, but then we ran it for the notebook, and it actually got better. So you can see there's value. So the point is, like, don't just throw 3 or 4 different models together. Look at the permutation importance of what features they find important, and if they're different, you're probably going to find that where they agree, they really, really agree, and that's probably really, really good. But if they all agree on the same things, it's probably not going to be as effective. And I'm going to hand it back to Tracy now, who's going to go through Bayesian optimization, which does this a lot more simply than I did.
So Nissan just tell you how to do feature engineering, how to identify some of the important features in the model. And then another thing that we could try to do to improve your model's performance is obviously hyperparameter tuning. So there are 4 common methods of doing this. The first one is manual, in which you literally just try out every single combinations of hyperparameters. You can also use grid search or random search. This grid search and random search is just like set up a grid of model hyperparameters and run an automatic loop through every single scenario. So it's still better than doing it manual for every single model. But another one, the problem with these method is that they do not take into account past evaluations. So that's why we decided to go with Bayesian optimizations, which does take into account past evaluations. I mean, I don't think that I can explain this in detail, like the mathematical or statistical formulas behind this kind of method, because there's a whole field of research dedicated to this particular field. Like, you can buy books about it. So I wouldn't just skip to the part when we actually can implement it with our deep learning model. So you can easily install a Bayesian optimizations library. And then after that, what you need to do is to define objective functions to optimize. And this is a code that I borrowed from work with Fast AI. And in this code, he tried to test out learning rate, weight decay, dropout rate, the number of layers, and the different layer sizes. And after that, you just need to feed your models, your deep learning models, and you just try to calculate the whatever metrics that you use for your model. So in this case, the area under the rock score, because it's a classification problem. And then you also need to specify a range of values for each of the parameters. But it's just a range, so you don't need to specify like a number. Like, for example, this one, learning range from 0.1 to 0.01, and then the layers can be from 1 to 3. And then after that, you can run your Bayesian optimization functions by just passing in that that objective functions, and then pass in your hyperparameter to tune. And the variables here equal to 2, it means it's just going to show you all of the iterations. And then if you call in optim.maximize, it's going to give you a list of the different score that you can get for the model, as well as the parameters that is going to give you those scores. And the best one that we got is number 9, which the accuracy score is around 0.962. And then what we can do later on is just to change the parameter of your deep learning model based on whatever that model give us. And we fit 6 epoch, and the final result that we got is 0.963. And if you compare to the result of your original deep learning model, it's actually there's an increase from 1.62 to 0.962 to 0.963, which in this particular problem it is quite significant, because if you look at the Kaggle leaderboard, for this problem the lowest accuracy score is around 0.95, and the highest is also about like 0.97. So an increase from 0.962 to 0.963 is an increase. So that's one of the methods that you can use to try to improve your deep learning model. And the last one that I want to mention is entity embeddings. And this is, like as someone in the class already mentioned before, that sometimes when we have categorical variables, which is really common in tabular data, is that in order to use those cat variables, we need to represent them as integers. And if there is intrinsic ordering in those numbers, for example, like low, medium, or high, then we can use those ranks for the numbers. But if there is no intrinsic ordering for them, then those will be just random numbers. And they will not provide any informations to our model. And if you think about it, a model will definitely perform better if the integers have some relevant informations about that particular cat variables. So one way to deal with this problem is obviously to use one-hot encoding. But because if you have a very big data set, for example, in this case, we have 300 different columns and we have 155 cat variables. And if you want to do one-hot encodings for this data set, it's crash my RAM server time. So obviously I would not go with that because it's very computationally expensive for this particular problem. So another way that you can try to do is to do entity embeddings. So what entity embedding does is that it can put similar values of the categorical variable closer together. So those values will actually have some meaning. And the way that you can do it is that you can first train a neural network model and then use the categorical embeddings of those of that neural network model, and then use the ones and replace the raw categorical columns in your XGBoost or in your random forest model and run it again. So a very quick way to do it, with fast AI, if you call learn.model.embed, you can actually see the list of all of the embedding layers of your fast AI deep learning model. And then these functions I borrow from fast AI forums. And this is an embedded feature functions in which what this function does is that it's just pull out all of the embedding layers of every single of your categorical variables and add it to your data set. So you won't have new cat variables, but you will still have the same continuous variables in your data set. So this is what this function does, and you can run these functions for both of your training and valid set. Then it's going to give you a new data set with the embedding layers. And I use those embedded layers to train my gradient boosting model. In this case, I just trained the same XGBoost model that we did above. Unfortunately, in this particular case, it doesn't seem to improve the score of our model. But as what Nissan mentioned before, we just need to try different methods. Sometimes one can work for this particular problem, and sometimes it may not work, but there's another options if you want to try this, and it is proven to be working for other problems in other data sets. So yeah, so that's the end of our presentations. We are going to share this is our blog, and we have a lot of different posts in this blog as well, and we are going to share this link to everyone, so if you want to like have a look or try to run it or etc. And we would love to hear feedback from the people from this class. I would definitely not being able to answer any questions on spot.
But we're in Tabular 1 in person, so all the links to different notebooks and all chats are there. So
Yeah.
feel free to like bug us individually or in there if you want to ask some questions about it. We don't know everything, but what we do know, we're willing to share.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, team. Yeah, cool that you guys got into some of the more advanced stuff with ensembling and stacking models. Very common if you want to win Kaggle competitions. You've got 3 models there. If you add another 50, you might get to the top of the leaderboard. And the other thing, another trick that they often do, so the sort of taking those embedded features from trained on a deep net. Another thing that I've seen on Kaggle as well is people will use t-SNE or some dimensionality reduction technique to collapse the feature, or even something like PCA, and add that feature set as an extra set of features. Again, all of this completely impractical in the real world, but if you want the extra 0.001 accuracy, stuff that you can do. But this is good, guys. The fact that you guys even have a blog post is awesome, that you've got a number of them, I know. So you guys are a perfect example of why blogging about what you're doing, sharing it, even just the act of writing it to formulate your ideas and share it with others is awesome. So really great to see. Thanks for sharing. Please put that link in there, and great job, guys. Cool. That is pretty much it for this week. Some other thoughts. Obviously, next week is the last formal lesson of the course. It is also the 9th week. It's the last lesson of the Fast AI course, and it's the 9th week that we all have together. So next week we'll sort of do a similar format to this. Mentors will probably figure this out over the next sort of 48 hours so that we can give you guys a pretty clear idea on what the dates are and what you guys need to do with your projects. But at this point, we're probably thinking that rather than do the final presentations in the 10th week, which would mean that you'd obviously have the final week of course content to do, and then you'd be doing your presentations. What we might do is actually make that 10th week sort of a final week for some of the other presentations that we've talked about. I think it makes sense to do some of the stuff about getting job ready and, what does ML look like in the wild, to do that after we've gotten through the course content. It'll also give you guys a little bit more headroom to work on your projects, finalize them, put them together. And then what we might do is have everyone sort of submit a summary of your projects, maybe a video if you can make it. We're going to have quite a number of teams who have projects, so what we'll probably do is try and sort of filter those down. Probably the mentors will do that. Maybe we'll have you guys help as well. And then we might take the top 6 to 8 teams and have them present at the Queensland AI meetup the following week. That way we can share. This is both for in-person and online people as well. So everyone is invited to submit, and then we can have sort of some judging and sort of share what we've done with the community. It does obviously mean that it will finally finish a week later, but I think there's enough upside that it makes sense, and it gives everyone a little bit more time to get it all ready and so on and so forth. So we will finalize that plan and give you guys a pretty clear idea of what the next few weeks look like by Friday, I would say. If you have any thoughts on that or any notes or why that might not work, just let us know. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming down. I really enjoyed tonight. I thought this was a really good one. So thanks for coming. Have a great week. Stay safe and see you soon.